At some point, people begin to notice that something about you has changed. They may not say it directly at first. Instead, it shows up as questions. Subtle ones. Why are you so quiet lately? Why don't you talk about things the way you used to? Why didn't you explain your decision? Why didn't you defend yourself? The questions are rarely hostile, but they carry tension, because they are not really questions. They are requests for justification, for reassurance, for the familiar version of you. And what unsettles people is that you don't meet those requests the same way anymore. Not because you're trying to withhold, not because you're being secretive, not because you want distance. You simply don't feel the impulse to explain yourself, and that absence creates friction. This is a stage that follows invisibility. After attention fades, after the need to be seen weakens, another layer falls away. The need to narrate your existence. The need to clarify who you are, what you mean, and why you're the way you are. You don't announce this shift. It just happens. You notice that when someone misunderstands you, you don't rush to correct it. When someone questions your choices, you don't assemble a defense. When someone is confused by your silence, you don't fill the gap. And then the fear arrives, not loudly, quietly. Am I becoming cold? Am I shutting people out? Am I losing empathy? Am I being arrogant? Because for most of your life, explaining yourself felt ethical. It felt responsible. It felt like proof that you cared. So when explanation fades, it can feel like something humane is disappearing. But this stage is not about withdrawal. It is about authority. And authority, at first, feels uncomfortable, especially to others. Let's name the tension directly. People start asking why you've changed, and you don't know how to answer them, not because you are hiding something, but because the old answers no longer fit. You could explain yourself. You still have language. You still understand your reasons. But explaining feels unnecessary, even distortive, like shrinking something whole into something defensible. And that instinct to not shrink can feel dangerous, because explanation once protected you. It kept relationships smooth. It prevented conflict. It signaled cooperation. So when you stop explaining, people may interpret it as resistance, or distance, or superiority, and you may briefly fear the same. Carl Jung observed that the ego relies heavily on explanation, not because explanation is wrong, but because explanation maintains control. To explain yourself is to manage how you are perceived. To justify is to negotiate your place. To defend is to stabilize identity through approval. Early in life, this is necessary. We explain ourselves to belong. We justify ourselves to be understood. We defend ourselves to survive misunderstanding. But as inner authority develops, the function of explanation changes. It becomes optional. And when something becomes optional, the psyche often lets it go, not dramatically, quietly. This is where misunderstanding arises. Others assume you are withholding, but you are not withholding. You are no longer managing. You are no longer narrating your inner life for external validation. And that can feel threatening to people who relied on that narration to understand where they stood with you, because explanation is relational currency. It reassures others that they're included, that they have access, that nothing important is happening without their awareness. When explanation fades, access changes, not out of exclusion, out of grounding. You are no longer living from the outside in. You are no longer checking yourself against reactions. So there is less to report, less to justify, less to clarify, and silence moves in, not defensive silence, accurate silence, silence that appears when there is nothing that actually needs to be said. This silence is often misread, because most silence in social life is strategic. It hides something, it avoids something, it punishes something. But this silence is different. It is not withholding information. It is the absence of compulsion. The compulsion to explain yourself usually comes from fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being judged. Fear of losing connection. So when fear decreases, explanation decreases. This is the part that unsettles people. Because fear-driven explanation looks like care. It looks like effort. It looks like engagement. And when that effort disappears, Others wonder if care disappeared with it. But care does not require explanation. Care requires presence. And presence does not announce itself. It simply responds when response is needed. This distinction is subtle. And because it is subtle, it is easily misinterpreted. You may notice that people project motives onto your silence. They say you're distant. They say you're closed off. They say you've changed. And they are right. You have changed, but not in the way they imagine. You have stopped negotiating your existence. You no longer feel responsible for managing how others interpret you. This does not mean you want to be misunderstood. It means you are no longer afraid of it. And that difference is crucial. Carl Jung believed that the ego explains itself because it fears losing control. Control over perception. Control over narrative. Control over belonging. When ego loosens, the need for control weakens. And with it, the need to constantly explain. This is why explanation fades after growth. Not because you become careless, but because you become anchored. Anchored people do not overclarify. They respond proportionally. They speak when something needs to be said. They are silent when speech would distort. But to someone who still equates explanation with respect, this feels unsettling, because silence offers no reassurance. It offers no narrative. It offers no defense. It simply stands. This can feel like rejection to those who expect access, and it can feel like guilt to you. You may find yourself tempted to over-explain again, to smooth things over, to reassure others that nothing is wrong, to say, I'm still the same person. But you're not internally, and trying to perform sameness creates tension, because it reactivates a structure you've already outgrown, the persona that explained itself constantly, the persona that stayed legible at all times, the persona that feared being misread. That persona worked, but it also kept you externally oriented, always watching how you landed, always adjusting, always translating yourself. This translation was exhausting, even if you never named it as such. Now that it has stopped, something else becomes visible. How much explanation was actually self-defense. How often you spoke not to communicate, but to preempt misunderstanding. How often you justified not because someone asked, but because you anticipated disapproval. When that anticipation fades, explanation fades with it. This is why the change feels involuntary. You didn't decide to stop explaining. You just noticed that the impulse wasn't there anymore, and that absence can feel socially risky, because society rewards transparency. But often what it calls transparency is performance, a continuous accounting of oneself, a willingness to narrate motivations on demand, a readiness to defend choices so others feel comfortable. But inner authority does not operate this way. Inner authority does not need to convince. It does not need to argue. It does not need to preemptively justify. It moves from alignment, and alignment does not need explanation. It needs clarity, and clarity is often silent. This silence is not emptiness. It is containment. You are no longer leaking yourself through constant narration. You are holding your center. And holding your center can look like distance to those who relied on your explanations for orientation. This is where the misunderstanding deepens. People may accuse you of changing values, of becoming rigid, of becoming inaccessible. But what has actually changed is that you no longer use explanation as a bridge, because explanation was never the bridge. It was a negotiation. True connection does not require constant explanation. It requires mutual presence. And mutual presence does not demand justification. This is difficult to accept at first, especially if you were socialized to believe that explaining yourself is a moral obligation, that not explaining is rude, that silence is suspicious. But those beliefs were formed in an earlier stage, a stage where belonging required legibility, where identity needed reinforcement, where misunderstanding felt dangerous. You are not in that stage anymore, and your psyche knows it, so it stops doing unnecessary work. And explanation is often unnecessary work. Not always, but often. This first step is not about encouraging silence. It is about recognizing why silence has appeared, why words no longer rush forward to protect you, why you are no longer compelled to clarify every boundary, why you can let misunderstanding exist without rushing to correct it. This is not because you don't care. It is because you trust your alignment more than others' interpretations. And that trust is new, fragile, easily shaken by social pressure, which is why this phase is uncomfortable, because you feel the pull to return, to explain again, to reassure again, to perform accessibility. And resisting that pull feels risky, because it may cost you approval, comfort, familiar roles. But growth often costs familiarity, not relationships. Familiar roles. People who related to your explanations may struggle when they are gone, not because you are wrong, but because the dynamic has changed. And step one is about sitting in that change without immediately fixing it, without reverting, without overcorrecting, without narrating your transformation to make it palatable. Because the moment you begin explaining why you no longer explain, you are explaining again, and the cycle resets. This stage asks for restraint. Not silence as a rule. Silence is accuracy. Speaking when something truly needs to be spoken, and letting the rest remain unspoken. Because what remains unspoken is not absence. It is authority. Authority without negotiation. And that is deeply unsettling in a world built on justification. In the next act, we will explore why constant explanation actually weakens authority, why silence often communicates more clearly than defense, and why this stage, though socially uncomfortable, is psychologically stabilizing. For now, notice the change. Notice how words no longer rush to protect you. Notice how you can let things stand, and resist the urge to immediately translate yourself back into something recognizable. This is not withdrawal. It is grounding. And grounding does not ask for permission. If phase one was the moment you noticed you had stopped explaining yourself, phase two is where the pressure to resume begins. Not from you, from others, and from the part of you that still remembers what explanation once provided. Because the world is not neutral about silence. It tolerates silence only when it understands it, and when it doesn't, it fills the gap with assumptions. You begin to feel this in small ways. A pause after you decline something without justification. A shift in tone when you don't elaborate. A subtle discomfort when you don't reassure. People start leaning forward, verbally or emotionally. They probe. They ask follow-up questions that aren't really questions. They want context. They want reasons. They want access. And when you don't provide it, the tension increases. This is where many people panic internally. They start questioning themselves. Am I being unfair? Am I being dismissive? Should I explain this better? Because explanation was once how you kept peace, how you smoothed edges, how you maintained connection. So when you stop explaining, it feels like you are breaking a social contract. But the contract you are breaking is not mutual. It is one-sided. It was an agreement where you were responsible for managing other people's comfort. Explaining yourself was not always communication. Often it was appeasement. This is difficult to see until you stop doing it. When explanation fades, you begin to notice how often you were explaining things that didn't actually require explanation. Your boundaries, your preferences, your timing, your no. You weren't being asked to clarify. You were being asked to justify. And justification assumes guilt. It assumes that your choices require permission. So when you stop justifying, something destabilizes. Not in you, in the dynamic. The other person feels a loss of control because explanation gave them leverage. It gave them something to negotiate with. When you explained, they could argue, they could persuade, they could reframe. Silence removes that leverage. And leverage loss often gets mislabeled as coldness. This is why people say things like, "You've changed. You're not as open as you used to be. You're hard to read now." What they are really saying is, "I no longer know how to influence you." And that realization is uncomfortable, not because they want power over you, but because the relational pattern has shifted. Carl Jung believed that the ego explains itself because it fears losing control. Control over narrative. Control over how it is understood. Control over belonging. When the ego loosens, the fear of losing control weakens, and with it, the compulsion to explain. But the social world still operates largely on ego exchange, on explanation, on justification, on signaling. So when you stop participating in that exchange, friction arises. This friction is often interpreted as conflict, but it is not conflict. It is misalignment. You are no longer operating from the same center. And misalignment feels threatening to systems that rely on predictability. Explanation made you predictable. It told others how to categorize you, how to respond, how to position themselves. Without it, you become less manageable, not intentionally, structurally. And this is where guilt often appears. Because you may still care deeply about people. You may still be considerate. You may still be kind. But kindness without explanation looks different. It looks quieter. It doesn't perform reassurance. It doesn't narrate empathy. It simply acts when action is needed. And for those accustomed to verbal confirmation, this feels insufficient. They may say, "I just want to understand." But often, understanding here means reassurance. Reassurance that they still have access, that nothing important is happening without them, that you are still legible. But inner authority does not promise legibility. It promises alignment. And alignment does not always explain itself. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening inside them. They think they are becoming emotionally unavailable. But emotional unavailability is avoidance. This is not avoidance. This is non-negotiation. You are no longer negotiating your inner state, your choices, your boundaries. That negotiation was exhausting, even if you never labeled it as such. Because negotiation requires you to doubt yourself just enough to open the door. Explanation is rarely neutral. It subtly undermines certainty. It invites debate. It places your decision on trial. So when you stop explaining, you are not becoming rigid. You are becoming settled. And settled people do not over-justify. They do not argue for their right to exist as they are. They simply exist. This is deeply unsettling in environments where explanation is currency, where everything must be justified, where silence is interpreted as defiance. But not all silence is defiance. Sometimes silence is completion. The conversation is already finished internally. There is nothing more to add, and adding would only distort clarity. This is a hard shift to trust, because it goes against social training. Most people are taught that explanation equals respect, that to not explain is rude. But this assumes explanation is always requested in good faith. Often it is not. Often, explanation is demanded to regain control, to reopen a closed decision, to keep you in dialogue when you are already clear. This is step 2, where you begin to see this pattern. And seeing it is uncomfortable, because it forces you to recognize how much of your past communication was driven by fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected, fear of being seen as wrong. When that fear weakens, explanation weakens. And when explanation weakens, relationships recalibrate. Some people adjust. They sense your groundedness. They stop pushing. They respect the boundary. Others escalate. They press harder. They accuse you of changing. They attempt to pull you back into explanation through guilt. This is not because they are malicious. It is because the old patterns serve them, and its disappearance feels destabilizing. But stability built on self-erasure is not stability. It is compliance, and compliance masquerading as kindness eventually fractures. This is why Carl Jung saw explanation as an ego function. It keeps identity in play. It keeps the self externalized. When identity dissolves, explanation loses its urgency. You no longer need to be understood, to be aligned. This does not mean misunderstanding feels good. It simply means it is tolerable. And tolerating misunderstanding without panic is a sign of maturity. This is where many people falter. They confuse tolerance with indifference. They think, if I don't explain, I don't care. But care does not require constant clarification. Care requires honesty. And honesty sometimes means letting others sit with their discomfort, especially when that discomfort is rooted in their expectations, not your behavior. Here is where restraint becomes the work. Not silence as a rule, restraint as discernment. You begin asking internally, is explanation actually required here? Not to be strategic, to be accurate. Sometimes explanation is necessary when harm has occurred, when clarity will genuinely help, when responsibility must be taken. But often, explanation is offered preemptively to soften impact, to manage perception, to avoid tension. When you stop doing that, tension appears. And sitting with that tension is the challenge of this stage, because tension invites resolution, and the easiest resolution is to explain, to overclarify, to say more than is needed. But doing so pulls you back into the old role, the role of translator, mediator, defender. You may notice something else during this phase. When you don't explain, people reveal more about themselves. Their assumptions surface. Their discomfort becomes visible. Their need for control shows. Explanation used to mask this. It smoothed over their anxiety. Now that it's gone, their reactions stand exposed. This can be uncomfortable to witness because it removes the illusion of mutual understanding, but it also clarifies dynamics. You see who required your explanations to feel secure, who respected your clarity without needing access. This is not about judging others. It is about seeing reality without cushioning. And reality without cushioning is sharp at first, but it is also honest. Here is where silence stops feeling neutral and starts feeling consequential. Your non-explanation changes outcomes. Conversations end sooner. Expectations shift. Some connections loosen. This can trigger grief, because you may miss the ease of being understood quickly, the familiarity of overcommunication. But ease built on self-negotiation is not ease. It is accommodation. And accommodation eventually demands a cost. You were paying that cost quietly. Now you are not, and the bill shows up elsewhere. In awkwardness, in misunderstanding, in others' discomfort. But this discomfort is not damage. It is recalibration. Relationships are adjusting to a new center of gravity, one where your inner authority is not up for debate, and that takes time. This phase does not offer reassurance, because reassurance would pull you back into explanation. Instead, it offers recognition. Recognition that the discomfort you feel is not a sign of becoming cold. It is a sign of becoming solid. And solidity changes how force travels. You don't absorb everything anymore. You don't diffuse tension automatically. You let it land. This can feel harsh, but it is actually respectful. It respects reality. It respects the other person's capacity to deal with their own reactions. It respects your own clarity. In the next section, we will explore what emerges when explanation fully dissolves, what communication looks like without justification, how silence becomes precise rather than defensive, and why this stage, though socially risky, creates deep internal stability. For now, notice the pressure. Notice how often you are invited to explain. Notice the impulse to comply, and see if you can pause, not to resist, but to check. Is explanation actually required here? Or is this an old reflex trying to reassert itself? That pause is the work of this phase. Eventually, something settles. Not because you decided anything, not because you made a rule, but because the pressure to explain finally releases. You stop bracing yourself for misunderstanding. You stop preparing clarifications in advance. You stop feeling responsible for how your choices land in other people's minds. And what remains is not silence as absence. It is silence as completion. This is the point most people never reach, because they mistake the discomfort of step 2 for a sign they've gone too far. They rush back into explanation, back into reassurance, back into justification. But if you stay long enough, something becomes clear. Explanation was never the source of connection. It was the management of anxiety, yours and others. When explanation dissolves fully, communication simplifies, not dramatically, precisely. You say what is necessary. You do not say what is not. There is no extra language to soften reality, no padding, no negotiation disguised as clarity. And this precision changes everything. You may notice that when you speak now, People listen differently. Not more, differently. Your words carry weight because they are not diluted. They are not trying to achieve multiple outcomes at once. They are not asking to be understood, accepted, and approved of simultaneously. They are simply true. And truth, when it is not defending itself, has a different quality. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It stands. Carl Jung believed that when the ego no longer needs to justify itself, the psyche becomes more integrated, not louder, more whole. And wholeness does not explain itself. It expresses itself through congruence. What you say aligns with what you do. What you do aligns with what you value. There is no gap that needs to be filled with explanation. This alignment is what others feel when they say, "You seem different." They may not be able to articulate it. They may misinterpret it. But they sense that something is no longer up for debate. Not because you are rigid, but because you are not split. When you are split internally, explanation tries to bridge the gap. When you are whole, there is no gap to bridge. This is where silence becomes communicative, not symbolic, not dramatic, communicative. A boundary does not need explanation to be real. A decision does not need justification to be valid. A change does not need narration to be authentic. You begin to trust this. And as you trust it, the urge to explain fades even further, not out of defiance, out of irrelevance. The question, "Should I explain?" stops appearing, because the question, "Do I doubt myself?" no longer drives it. This is a subtle but decisive shift. Explanation was often a way of checking yourself externally, of testing whether your inner sense made sense to others. Without that testing, you rely on a different reference point, inner authority. Inner authority does not mean certainty about everything. It means you no longer outsource certainty. You can be unsure without being apologetic. You can be firm without being aggressive. You can be silent without being evasive. This balance is rare, and it takes time to trust, because silence has consequences. People will misunderstand you. Some will mislabel you. Some will project onto you. And you will not rush to correct them, not because you don't care, but because you know that clarity forced is not clarity received. People hear what they are ready to hear. Explanation cannot override readiness, and trying to do so only entangles you again. This is where peace begins to replace tension, not peace as comfort, peace as non-reactivity. You are no longer pulled into every interpretive loop. You do not chase every misreading. You do not defend every choice. And the energy this frees up is significant. That energy returns to living, to attention, to presence, to doing what actually needs to be done, rather than managing how it appears. You may notice that your relationships reorganize at this stage. Some grow quieter but more stable. They no longer rely on constant clarification. They function through trust. Others fall away, not in conflict, in silence, because they required explanation to exist. They needed you to perform accessibility. When that performance ends, there is nothing to hold the dynamic together. This can feel like loss, and it is, but it is the loss of a role, not a connection. A role where you were responsible for interpretation, for reassurance, for smoothing reality. Without that role, what remains is either real connection or nothing. This is painful, but it is honest, and honesty is stabilizing, even when it costs something. Carl Jung believed that individuation often leads to simplification of life, not expansion, simplification. Fewer explanations, fewer justifications, fewer identities to maintain. And this simplification can look like withdrawal from the outside, but internally it feels like relief, because you are no longer fragmented across narratives. You're not explaining one thing while feeling another. You are not acting in one direction while defending in another. There is coherence, and coherence does not speak much. It doesn't need to. This does not mean you become mute. It means speech becomes intentional. When you speak now, it is because something needs to be said, not because something needs to be defended, not because something needs to be clarified prematurely, not because someone is uncomfortable. This is the difference between explanation and communication. Explanation seeks to control perception. Communication seeks to convey reality. One is ego-based. The other is grounded. And grounded communication does not overextend itself. It trusts that what needs to land will land. And what doesn't, won't. This trust is the final stabilization. You no longer feel compelled to be understood by everyone. You no longer equate misunderstanding with failure. You no longer fear that silence means distance. Silence simply means silence. And silence is no longer a problem to solve. This is where the actionable shift completes itself. You no longer just ask, is explanation actually required here? You begin to feel the answer immediately, in your body, in your timing, in the absence of urgency. If explanation is required, it arises naturally. If it is not, nothing pushes you to speak. This is not indifference. It is accuracy. Accuracy is quiet. It does not justify itself. And because it does not justify itself, it does not weaken itself. You may notice that others begin to respond differently to you over time. Some will respect the clarity. They will stop pushing. They will adjust. Others will keep pushing. And you will stop engaging, not as punishment, as boundary. A boundary that does not need to be announced. This boundary is not rigid. It is stable. And stability is what people feel when they say, "You seem grounded." They may not like it, but they recognize it. And recognition without control is unsettling. But it is also clean. You are no longer negotiating your existence. You are no longer explaining why you are the way you are. You are no longer translating yourself into acceptable language. You are simply living. And living does not require defense. This is the quiet authority Carl Jung pointed toward. Not dominance, not superiority. Authority is alignment. Authority as non-negotiation with what is true for you. This authority does not announce itself. It does not correct others. It does not need to win arguments. It simply refuses to participate in unnecessary ones. And this refusal is not avoidance. It is discernment. You have learned where explanation serves clarity and where it serves fear. And you no longer confuse the two. This is the end of the arc for explanation, not silence as a rule. Silence as integrity. Speech as integrity. Both arising from the same place. A place that no longer needs to prove itself. When justification ends, presence remains, and presence is enough. If this reflection resonated, consider staying with this work. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue exploring these quiet psychological shifts through the lens of Carl Jung. And if you know someone who is living the same inner transition but doesn't yet have the words for it, share this with them. Sometimes clarity travels better when it's recognized, not explained.